bit louder.
Yes, okay.
Hello, testing.
Does this sound okay?
Testing.
Please not singing, speaking.
Speak. You can't sing. Can you hear us? Yes? Okay.
I think I can.
Lower.
Lower?
Yes.
Like this?
It's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Shiraz.
Yes, Shiraz. Testing.
Shiraz.
1, 2, 3.
Okay.
Is this good?
Yes.
Working? Perfect. Thank you.
Take your seats, would be very kind if you would do so. As we are live, we have to start on time. And as I think it is 6 o'clock now, I would love to welcome all of you to our special live stream evening event called Talking About Art, When Art Imitates Life, here in the Hall of Contemporary Art of Deichtorhallen, Hamburg. My name is Dirk Lupo. I'm the artistic director of the Deichtorhallen. And this program, Talking About Art, exists since more than 5 years and was made possible and supported by EY, and therefore I would like to express my deep gratitude to EY for their generosity. We are thrilled to have such an esteemed panel of artists tonight, including Bani Abidi from Berlin and Karachi, Pakistan, as well as Shiraz Bayjoo from London and Mauritius, the island Mauritius, and as well Michael Rakowitz, who unfortunately is unable to attend tonight personally, but we will see and hear him by a video message. I also would like to welcome very much our wonderful hosts. There's Sofia Victorino from Lisboa. She was for a long time responsible for the education and public program at the Museo Serralves in Porto and at the Whitechapel Gallery in London. She's an internationally acclaimed researcher and curator, just like Dr. Omar Kholeif, the director of the SHARJAH Art Foundation Collection and senior curator. The talk tonight takes place of our current exhibition In the Heart of Another Country, brilliantly curated by Omar, a path-breaking exploration of contemporary art and visual culture featuring some 150 seminal artworks from the SHARJAH Art Foundation collection by 61 artists from all corners of the globe, in particular from Southwest Asia, as well as North Africa, the Caribbean, Europe, United States. And the works on display in this show examine the significance of the concept of diaspora and illuminating human experiences with migration, with colonial history, with displacement, with mobility, forced mobility, and this through 3 generations of artists. So that's the reason why we have this title, Diasporic Imagination, highly topical in our times, I think. We feel it as a great privilege to have you here on the panel to discuss these issues from your perspectives, through the lenses of your own very different historical backgrounds and biographies. And I think it's a unique, a very rare opportunity to dive deeper into the concept of art imitating life and how it is portrayed in today's contemporary art scene. So I thank you very much for being here. I thank you very much for being there. And I'm looking forward to an enlightening discussion and give the floor to, I think, Omar. Thank you so much.
Sofia.
To Sofia. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dirk. I'm really delighted to be here in Hamburg and to be sharing this stage with dear colleagues and friends and artists whose work I've admired for a very long time. I'd like to thank the invitation to my friend and colleague Omar Kholeif, because we've been exchanging ideas and conversations for a very long time. So for me it was quite emotional to have the chance to visit this show and discover many new works and being taken on this journey across geographies and generations. This exhibition, In the Heart of Another Country, the Diasporic Imagination in the SHARJAH Art Foundation collection, it addresses how multiple diasporas and their histories, in a way, intertwine. And I think the exhibition also reflects on how different artists and very different artistic practices have addressed themes such as the politics of history, ideas of invisibility and erasure, but also ideas of archives and material memories, and to a certain degree, acts of care and resilience. But to contextualize the framework of the whole exhibition, I would like to begin by prompting some questions to the curator, and because I think that will help us situate the SHARJAH Art Foundation collection in the context of this proposition, curatorial proposition. So, Omar, I would like to begin by asking you if you could share with us the conceptual framework for the show, the research that has been involved, over 6 years of research that you've dedicated to this exhibition, and the way in which the concept of diaspora, but also the idea of imagination and poetry runs through the different chapters of the exhibition.
Thank you so much, Sofia, for the question, and to everyone for being here. It's a privilege to be asked a question alongside artists, because I do see the practice of a curator or the exhibition making that I do as an artistic practice. I don't identify with the term curator, and I think that's really important in the context of this show, which actually began in 2016 with a text that I wrote. I had just moved back to the United States, and I was asked by Poetry Magazine, so this is how poetry comes in, to reflect on the work of the late Ital Adnan. And I wrote an essay, a short essay called To Speak with Many Tongues, about the concept of my lived experience, but also the artists who I worked with's lived experience of constantly feeling that they had to assimilate into different contexts in society, specifically in the United States. And then I met this gentleman over here, Dirk Luckwell, at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. An encounter was organized by a gallerist here in Berlin, Andres Versammler, and it was just, we saw an exhibition of exactly what we didn't want to do. And in a sense, at that moment, the proposition emerged to create a show that reflected, in the context of Germany, a continuation of exhibitions that I had seen here, specifically Documenta in 2002 and Okwi and Wazer's The Short Century, which were case studies in my PhD that looked at what it meant to think about a specific place or topography. And from there, I said to Dirk, well, we need to be ethical, we need to think of budget, and so maybe we should focus in on one place. And I said, I'm curating this SHARJAH biennial, but it's a secret still. And I'm looking into their collection, and I think we could tell the story for this collection. Little did I know I would be offered this job to then become the custodian of that collection, which then completely changed the story, right? Because you then start to create a different view. So essentially, this exhibition is an attempt to narrativize multiple different sets of artistic practice and meaning through essentially thinking about poetry as a gateway or language as a gateway to think about how formal histories emerge through encounters. Encounters with a place, be it SHARJAH, which is a seat where an imagination can be birthed, or whether it is through the actual creation and dispersal of artworks by various individuals. But in the end, what I kind of hoped would emerge is something that moved against this idea, or this forced idea, that we should exist within the framework of a collective imagination, but actually celebrate the singularity of the artistic voice, and instead think of how, when things exist in a collection or a museum, we're actually looking at a palimpsest, a layered set of histories, not a homogeneous set of histories that we say that is other. And so that is why Dirk's idea at the end to have a map that actually shows the kind of roots and movements of the artist, it kind of creates a very interesting endpoint to this story, which is the last chapter is called Going South, and we're literally facing south when you look at it. And that map goes to show that the majority of the artists in this exhibition do not live below the equator. And so can we start to interrogate whether the context in which we are situated, and can we indeed invite, use an exhibition to invite artists to create a space to self-identify with their own language that they have chosen.
Another aspect I'm very curious of, and that I find very striking in the exhibition, is its spatial and architectural configuration. You take us through a staging which at times seems highly choreographed, although leaving the visitor a lot of space to interact with those layered histories. But can you tell us about how you conceived this architecture? I know in dialogue with colleague architect Todd Rice, but can you start to unpick how the colors, the forms, the rhythms, the shapes take us on that journey?
So I never used to work with exhibition designers or architects because I used to find them very arrogant. And then one day I loved the act of staging, the maquette and drawing. But that kind of changed in exhibition making. People stopped bringing out the maquette. They would just expect that you would hang it all at 150 centimeters to the middle, and that's it. And one day I was sitting with him in Sharjah when he was visiting, doing research for a book about Sharjah, building Sharjah, and I was telling him about a difficulty I had with a show, and he created a solution. And that was a show called Art in the Age of Anxiety, which was one of the most ambitious shows that I had realized at that point. And so when this proposition finally came to life, I invited him and he worked with the team here to develop something. And the starting point for his proposition was to think of this. He gave me the context of this place, that this was a vessel, a train station, a place site of movement. The trains that moved from here to now the Hamburger Bahnhof in Berlin. So this idea of movement then became key, thanks to him and his research. But also then we started to think of the topography of the space and to actually situate multiple sight lines by building almost a cityscape in the exhibition, having walls at different heights, but also using existing walls and planning ahead for the exhibitions that would follow. But the colors, people ask a lot about the colors, and that's not necessarily clearly explained, is that he created a map, it looked like Pangea, with all these different colors when he first proposed his first idea. And he said, you know, in a map you have a legend of colors that denotes the different aspects. And he said, for me, I had grouped the works into different feelings, I called them, or thought forms, or thought bubbles. Thought forms, Karen Christoph Bakargi borrowed from her in that case. And he gave each a color that would recur. So the idea is that you might encounter Huguette Caland once and see one work, and then you'll see her again in another chapter. But the return of the color is like you're meeting an old friend, right? So it's cartographic in that sense, but it's also about creating a subconscious sense of this is familiar. This is something that it's not an unknown space. And I have to say that the scenography, it really is a thing in dialogue, but also the space is challenging. But that's the most exciting thing, is that I often say that this exhibition is, and I'll stop talking, I promise, in a minute, is for me, I see it as a museum in a temporary form of exile, because I was hired essentially to help create a permanent home for this collection and to build a strategy for it and we were not able to pursue that at the time due to the pandemic. And this is the largest single presentation of this collection. It is the single largest presentation in one space of any work that Sharjah Art Foundation has done outside of its own doors or campus. And these works cannot be assembled in this way in another space. They are site-specifically contextualized, and that also formed different sets of meaning. So at the end, when you literally move from Bani's work to then Emily's work through to Nari's work and Camp's work and Taloy Havini's work and Harar Sarkisian, and you're kind of going into this kind of elevation, I call it, this transcendental moment of taking flight, where literally you're invited to leave the exhibition thinking about, well, what complicity do I have in the world, and in terms of what has happened in all of these different historical contexts, and where does my imagination sit in all of this as an individual?
Thank you. I would now like to ask Bani and Shiraz about the works in the show, but as a starting point for maybe expanding on a broader conversation regarding the ideas that have shaped much of your work. And some of those ideas relate to notions of home, belonging, European colonial legacies, and in a way they have materialized very often, I would say, through the use of archives and how you've dealt with archives. So maybe we start with Bani, and you can share with us what prompted this project, Proposal for a Man at Sea, but maybe as an excuse to open up to your wider practice and the ideas around it.
I mean, I don't usually work with... can you hear me? Now it's better. It's interesting because I think there's only a couple of times when I've worked with archives. And in this case, Proposal for a Man in the Sea is a photo documentary installation that came about when I had set out to make a fiction film, which actually showed in the last documenter, and that film was called Death at a 30-Degree Angle. And I was looking at monumental statue making. But in a slightly satirical, humorous manner, because I was living in India at that time, and one of the chief ministers of the state, Uttar Pradesh, was a woman, and her coming to power was a very interesting set of, interesting trajectory. And she was of the Dalit caste, and one of the first, the unscheduled caste, so to speak, and she was, one of the first things that she started doing when she came into power was to start having statues made of herself, carrying a handbag of hers. And the politics of her trying to do that was particularly interesting because it was as if she was sort of claiming that this is a short moment when our caste gets to take on this position, and I'm going to make sure there's lots of me in marble or in fiberglass all over the country and all over the state. So she got very involved in very monumental, grand architecture that was all about stone. So she didn't even rely on any trees or anything. It was all about leaving a mark that was very hard to destroy. So I was living in India, and there was a lot of press about her, and especially the fact that there were 100 statues of hers, huge ones, that were called back because the handbag was in the wrong hand. And so she just rejected them. So it was so pompous and grand, and I had been thinking a lot about statues just through my travel, and I'm interested in questions of how people in power want to leave their imprint. So I'd been thinking about statues a lot, and I decided to to make a film about the making of a statue, which would be about a small-time politician who has some money and he wants to get a statue made of himself, and he can't decide whether he wants to pose as an intellectual, as a warrior, as a politician. And in that search for a site of where I would shoot this film, I came across this gentleman who had actually made made statues for Indian politicians for the past 60 years. He was 80 at the time. His name is Ram Sutar. That's what the work is. He's who the work is about. And his space was overwhelming and beautiful. It was an incredibly, 3-storied high studio with Rabindranath Tagore and Indira Gandhi and Nehru and the whole pantheon of Indian heroes and politicians just kind of hanging out there, covered in pigeon shit because they're all old molds. It was very cinematic, and it was one of those moments where you're like, okay, this is far more interesting than what I had set out to do, and mine is such a small proposition compared to this man's life. So I decided to actually ask him to act in my film, and I brought my fictional character into his studio. So there was a fictional element, and then there was a documentary element where he himself was one of the protagonists, gentleman. But this work is about him, because what had happened is that Indian politics had changed in the course of his life. And he was a true Gandhian who believed in, the removal of caste separation and discrimination and an egalitarian idea of India. And he had made many propositions for, he said, I want to build a statue of Gandhi in the Arabian Sea, and it should be higher than the Statue of Liberty. And he's holding the hands of 2 Dalit children, and I really want the world to enter India seeing that. And he said, these are all the drawings and Photoshop projects I've done and the maquettes, but no one wants to make this anymore because politics had changed and it was much more local, and there were a lot more regional and ethnic divides in the kind of space and cultural space that people, public statues that people wanted to create. So there was no space left for that. So it was kind of a very hidden dream of his, and he never got to make it. So I just spent a lot of time in his studio talking to him and photographed his archives. And so that's why it's called Proposal for a Man in the Sea, because it's an unrealized project, and it is completely a changed India. That sculpture will never get created. So, yeah, I don't know.
And you mentioned in the conversation we had before and for the exhibition catalog, you said you were also interested in a certain generation, very much connected to this idea of nation building.
Yes.
Can you talk us through how that comes into
it's
the
very
work?
interesting. I think that I've done other work where it is my father's generation. Basically, my parents were from India. My mother's now 90. My father passed away, but they were teenagers at the time India and Pakistan split, and the subcontinent was freed from the British. So there were all kinds of different. It was very much about that generation, and you don't see those politics and those dreams anymore. So it was also a way of revisiting that. It was very much about working with an older man who had seen the country change and witnessed an earlier dream or a moment. And so, yeah, I've done other work historically with other people from that time as well.
Okay, so maybe now we ask Shiraz, how do these narratives of personal histories and larger political, the weight of larger political and often traumatic stories, how does that come into your work?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of parallels actually with what I'm listening to from Bani. And, I mean, Mauritius, where I'm originally from, it's island colony, sugar plantation. It started off with slavery brought in through the Dutch and then the French, and it also becomes the place where the British experiment indentured labour before it gets rolled out throughout the British Empire. So it has a complex history, complex layerings, but at the same time, it is almost a complete creation of the colonial project. You know, it is not a place that is noted for having been inhabited, you know, by or any major settlements, you know, prior to sort of European arrival. And those sort of things are partly to do with the geographics of the Indian Ocean and the movements of currents and oceanic winds, and so the islands become almost this paradigm of what the colonial legacies are. And I think, you know, at the beginning of my, you know, I think back in 2012, as my practice was shifting back towards Mauritius and thinking about, you know, spent so much time, I think, as lots of artists, you know, partly based within the West and partly based, you know, in our places, our homes of origin, thinking about, you know, these conversations around diaspora. And actually, for me, there were so many huge missing parts to those conversations that take place here, that take place elsewhere, and that actually they needed to be unfolded, they needed to be opened up actually in spaces such as Mauritius. And I think, you know, part of that understanding was, you know, looking at monuments, looking at the architecture. Like you were saying, I do spend a lot of time doing archive research, but a lot of it is also looking at the language of public and private spaces and the ways in which we memorialize, the ways in which that we've sort of twisted and turned ourselves in order to be able to live with these monolithic histories, and actually the impending traumas that get passed down, and how through each generation of people that gets filtered into a slightly different way of dealing of and subverting of so many of these traumas. How do we live with the violence of the past when it's still so incredibly present, you know, in the architecture of our societies? And so Mauritius, like so many places, you know, has to build itself out of the post-colonial, you know, out through decolonization. It has to rebuild itself. You know, decolonization is not an academic pursuit, right, in the global south. It is a reality of what most, you know, what we would say, at least, you know, well, 3/4 of the world has to build itself out, you know, post. You know, and we have to also understand a lot of these countries did not get their independence until, I think Mauritius was 1968. I mean, I know places were in the early 70s, you know. So, you know, so there's a huge amount of unpacking, but also what became so interesting in Mauritius is that actually so much of the architecture of colonialism was maintained, was held onto. And these were sort of some of my early questions as to why is it that the contemporary parliament of this new free nation is actually the old governor's house. What is the parts of it? And I think parts of that question is actually that we can't undo our past, so we have to figure out ways that we live and that we move forward with it. So it then becomes this interesting sort of process of looking at things that are being preserved, but also things that are being deliberately allowed to fall away, to decompose. And I think that starts to speak so much about where the new nation, where the visions of nationhood and nation building that language starts to evolve. But it's not just in the public space, it's also, you know, the little windowsill that your grandmother keeps, you know, with the small little groupings of objects. It's these kinds of, in a way, what Omar was saying, you know, we hate this word curation, but actually we all curate our personal spaces, right? We curate our lives every day. And the things we hold on to, the things that we allow to fall away, I think speak so much of that. So that is the starting point of.
But again, in your film, you do it in a very poetic and gentle way, even the way you work with sound or how the camera moves. We hear like whispers, voices, singing, political speeches. So again, there's this kind of layering of multiple perspectives and positions.
Yeah. I mean, how do you speak of such extreme layerings of violence that take place, you know, because we have to understand the colonial project was not administered through education or through expansion. It was administered through extraction and violence was the methodologies. You know, when we talk about, they talk about the British Empire as being the greatest ledger in history, but to make all of those people fit into those neat little boxes of numbers, of production, actually you're talking about the erasures of language, huge amounts of indigenous spaces and landscapes that are being erased. So how do we speak about that violence in a contemporary time, you know, at this moment, without recreating that violence, right? Because that is one of the things that I don't want to do in my work, is to continuously project that same violence that has begun. So I think poetics is a really important way in which we can cut through it and allow ourselves to be able to digest, to be able to absorb parts of it, to be able to understand. And also, you know, at times when we can't just read these things directly, again, because of their enormity. So we have to, in a sense, be able to emotionally navigate parts of these histories. And I think it's also those multiple retellings, because it's not just my story, it's not just your story, it is the collectivities, the multiple tellings, right? The multiple possibilities of what have come from it. And I think at the center of that is love. There is a lot of love that you can see of what allows people to keep doing.
I wanted to comment on that, because this is a question that I have, is you intimate that one of the things from the legacy of the colonial project is how do we rebuild? But of course, we're not trying to rebuild or reconstitute something of the past. We're trying to imagine not a future, but a present. And I find that one of the difficulties is that we get stuck imagining a future or reconstituting a past, that in the end, we become self-defeating. We become unable to contour a space, to exist in the world as ourselves. And I say that as individual artists, practitioners, but also the nation states that we hail from. We look at their current socio-political condition. I'm not saying here is any better, but it's not, liberation and independence hasn't led to at least a semblance of stability. So how does one deal with that pressure, I suppose, to, or not pressure, but the necessity to create a space that is kind of porous enough to not, to allow that imagination to form? Or is it a challenge to take a position in one way or another? For both of you, this is a question.
To take a position regarding, I mean, these days I'm very, I'm thinking a lot about living beyond the nation state, and just because, I mean, I have the luxury to do that because I'm at a distance, but I, in a biographical way, my child has an Indian passport, my ex-husband is Indian, and we can't live in the land that I so love to make work with in India or in Pakistan. And then when you start breaking it apart, and at this point, these two countries are, I mean, the way they define themselves against each other in terms of religion, Islam and Hinduism, etc., is at its worst, at its peak. And yet, if you take away the short period of them being two different nation states, there's the self-identification before that, which is that, and that's an interesting thing when you talk about the violence of the colonial project. Some of the things are not even understood as violence. Yeah? So the idea that the concept of Hindu-Muslim is a colonial concept because it's a naming and structuring. And I think that is very fascinating, because we forget that a religion and different sects of religion, you're Shiite, you're Sunni, these are all forms of indexing, of organization, of a demographic. And I'm reading these days about sacred spaces in Pakistan and in India, where people could be Hindu and Muslim and a bit of this and that, and they didn't know it because there were no names. And now, so yourself was porous, and now it's completely not. We are from birth with the creation of the nation state, with the passport. There are choices made at everything. What are you in terms of your gender, religion, everything? So I think that just the trying to be legible, being made legible in the eyes of, in our case, the British, took away the possibility of being much more in one sort of person or community. So that is what my current interest is.
And very similarly, Mauritius, a racialized labor force, as it were, that is created, and the problematics of that continue to permeate today. Homogenization. That we have a very large Hindu population, which today aligns itself towards Modi's India. Much of the Muslim communities that we have, have looked back towards the Middle East, and yet on the island, we have what we call our Creole community. We're actually all Creole on the island, because we are all created through these multiple layerings, this mixing, this pressurized melting pot that is created through those systems of forced labor, and yet for those who cannot deny their direct links to slavery or to being enslaved ancestry because of their very visible Afro or very direct lineages to East Africa. There is no homogenizing. There is no group that community links to. And actually, in contemporary times, they're actually been converting to Rastafarianism, connecting to the Caribbean, this particular community, to find an agency, a voice beyond the island in a way that other groups have tried to form themselves. So this idea that actually I come from somewhere else, I'm empowered because of this particular group, it's an imagined connection. Because as you're describing yourself, Omar, there is no building back, because the back, what was it that we came from in the first place? So these become falsities, and homogenization becomes such a major paralyzing factor in the ability for our, if we don't call them a nation group, but our peoples, how they actually move forward. And so homogenization really becomes such a massively crippling thing, and it becomes an elitist idea, to the point where today you have politicians who have gained power, or political families have gained power by describing themselves as being coming from indentured labor, for example. But actually, when they've looked through the actual family archives, they found that actually they didn't come on that basis, but they've created a complete political dynasty based on that group and that power dynamic of that relationship to that voting group. So there are all these incredible falsities, and that they become more critical. And we have got to points, I think, today where actually it is at a point of quite critical problematics.
Omar, do you think this would be a good time for us to share Michael's testimonial letter that he prepared for this event? Because I think this notion that you've also touched upon of restitution and repair is intimately connected to the ideas that Michael Rakowitz is prompting, both in his presentation this evening, but also through the work The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, and the film, which was commissioned by yourself, The Ballad of Special Ops Cody. And I think this could be a good transition to think about these notions of violence, repair, and restitution in connection as well to art institutions and institutional practice. So if we could please have Michael Rakowitz.
Greetings, everyone. My name is Michael Rakowitz. I'm an artist and a teacher from Chicago. I wish I could be with you in person, and I send my best to Omar, Sofia, Bani, and Shiraz. I'm really happy to be making this presentation in the context of the exhibition In the Heart of Another Country, curated by Omar Kholeif, with whom I've been fortunate to work and dream, and someone I'm even more lucky to call a dear friend and really a brother. This is all part of a project that links us from Sharjah to Chicago and now to Hamburg, where I'm showing a film that we made together and which has taken on multitudinous meanings since it was first made. and also where I'm showing my ongoing work, The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, which was shown in the Sharjah Biennial in 2007, continued in Chicago, was acquired when it was shown in Chicago, and is now being shown in Germany in a museum in exile, or rather a museum that is still waiting to be formed and constituted for the Sharjah Art Foundation's public collection. For my presentation, I'm going to be sharing my screen, and so I hope you'll bear with me while I do this. Okay. In January of 2020, Claire Bishop and Nikki Columbus published a speculative review of the newly expanded Museum of Modern Art in New York, or better known as MoMA. Their positive assessment of the MoMA that we should have versus the one we got opened up a new territory where criticism and visionary architecture met. Visionary architecture, while often optimistically broadcasting a desire, is simultaneously rooted in inevitable failure. Typically relegated to models or drawings due to the laws of the city or the law of gravity, the residual idea nevertheless demands a culture capable of bringing about its existence. When we demand radical change, we're often asked, what does it look like? So I wanted to share with you a proposal that tries to show that the visionary need not just be speculative. Versions of this proposal are now being seriously considered by several institutions, and the proposal has been made in light of the many recent initiatives at encyclopedic museums to invite artists from post-colonial countries to make work in dialogue with antiquities. The context for the proposal is a project I began in 2006 called The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist. The centerpiece is an ongoing series of sculptures that attempts to reappear life-size the 7,000 plus archaeological artifacts looted from the National Museum of Iraq during the 2003 US-led invasion, using Middle Eastern food packaging and Arab American newspapers. In 2015, this project grew to include archaeological sites destroyed by groups like ISIS, also known as Daesh, in the aftermath of the US-led invasion. An example of this is the demolished Lamassu that stood at the Nergal Gate of Nineveh since 700 BCE, and which I reappeared on the fourth plinth in London's Trafalgar Square in 2018, built from 10,500 empty Iraqi date syrup cans. In another extension of this project, my studio assistants and I have been faithfully reappearing each of the rooms in King Ashurnasirpal II's 9th century BCE Northwest Palace of Nimrud, or as it's known in Assyrian, Kalhu. It was also destroyed by ISIS near present-day Mosul in northern Iraq in 2015. When exhibited in a gallery or museum, blank spaces are left to indicate the previous removal of certain panels, now located in the collections of various Western museums. In winter 2020, I began to wonder how this project could go further to acknowledge the continued history of displacement in Iraq, and more than that, push toward restitution. In response to an invitation from a major American museum to display some of these panels, I sent the following letter, one that is currently being considered by an institution in North America. Dear Encyclopedic Museum Curator, my apologies for being late to reply. When you wrote, I was laid up with the flu, and after a few days of travel, I received some difficult news about my mother's health. The reliefs from Room F that you inquired about will be on view at the Nasher Sculpture Center until early May, so it will be certainly possible for the work to be shown at your museum in the context of the Assyrian reliefs during the time you've proposed. But I wonder if we may think more audaciously and provocatively about how to do this. As you know, Daesh's destruction of the Northwest Palace of Nimrud was followed in late 2018 by the auctioning of a relief that was in the possession of the Virginia Theological Seminary. The price paid for this relief, $31 million by an anonymous private collector, was enhanced by the demolition of the palace 3 years before. And while the money will be used for the admirable purpose of funding a scholarship at VTS, the auction bolstered further the narrative of Iraq as a site of extraction and speculation. I'm hoping my work can impact and support efforts to interrupt this cycle. In the past few years, I've been focusing more on institutional responsibility and my commitments as an artist, descended from an Iraqi Jewish mother forced to depart her homeland. A desire to return, despite its impossibilities, fuels so much of my practice. A multitude of Iraq's cultural heritage now exists outside of its borders, away from its people, and what remains has been targeted for destruction. But what perishes is not just the monumental reliefs of colossal figures of deities like the Lamassu. It is the communities of people who live alongside them. The DNA of those lives cannot be 3D printed and replaced. That is why I've come to call my works not reconstructions, but reappearances, or ghosts of the originals, an imperfect and vulnerable offering that will one day also disappear. Let me say without hesitation that it would be a pleasure to collaborate with you on this project. But in order to do this, I'd like to up the ante and create a more complex agreement. I'd like to gift the museum the entirety of Room F, Section 1, free of charge, in exchange for the return to Iraq of the panel from Room F currently in your museum's collection. Given all that has been destroyed in Iraq, and the intersection of that destruction with the West's insatiable appetite for the objects of the East, while not always, if ever, extending that concern to its people, this return of an original would be more than just restitutive. It would be restorative. So much is missed when our conversations around decolonization rest only on questions of repatriation. I liken this to the inadequacy of apology versus accountability. Apology, when uttered, unburdens the person saying it more than it heals the person to whom it was directed. But true accountability is an ongoing repair through discourse and reckoning. It is never finished. Restoration exists as a practice within every museum that I have known. In fact, when I visited your museum in January, the director took me to the area where some of the reliefs were being moment. The Apkalu, the deities pictured in the reliefs, were like figures in the round. I was seeing the relief as if it had turned its back on me, as if it were walking away, going home. Please understand the absolute sincerity in my proposal here, and please do not perceive this as a vilification of the museum, the work you do, or some unkind purity judgment of the museum's collections. The best one can hope for in doing any kind of work is that it will continue to teach and that we will be open to learning. We know that museums are important and at their best they can be based on a mutual curiosity among the world's cultures. But we cannot ignore the cultural traumas caused of the extraction of many of these works, nor the imperative to break this cycle and restore dignity and humanity to the people that have been parted from their cultural heritage. For a long time, I thought I was making these reappearances to replace what was destroyed in Iraq. I imagine that one day perhaps my reappearances might end up in places like Nineveh, Nimrod, Mosul, or Baghdad. Yet, what was destroyed in Iraq was disappeared in part because the West valued it so much. And so I wish to complicate my work even more by acknowledging that a ghost needs to haunt. It is not, however, the Iraqis who need to be haunted. It is us. I thank you for reading this and hope you and the museum will think seriously with me on this proposal. Sincerely, Michael.
Well, thank you to Michael for this very
Thank you very much.
strong and urgent statement, I believe. But I'd like to ask Omar to respond, because I know you have some thoughts in the notebook that you brought, which also refers to...
Actually, I wasn't going to mention the notebook, but yes, maybe I could start there, which was, I lived in Chicago, just down the road from Mike, and I did an exhibition of his at the MCA, and on the opening he gave me this notebook, which I was too afraid to use, which says, "For Omar, this book was made in Palestine before 1948. Let's fill it with beautiful wishes and desires. It is an honor to work with you, loved Michael." And I thought that today I should use it to think with him in his absence, because he's kind of the ghost that he discusses, in that a ghost needs to haunt is just a kind of really jarring proposition. But it is actually the most difficult aspect of all the things that we are trying to do, which is that we don't want to be situated in some memory box that you have constructed. We don't even want to exist within the confines of the language that we created ourselves, i.e. the notions of how we perceived ourselves as framed as other. We want to not reappear. We want to be restituted as restored objects, in a sense. And that is, I think, an interesting link to this show for me, because what people don't understand as to why something could take 6.5 years is that every single work in this show was either acquired in those years because of discussions that were ongoing and strategies that were formed to develop a proposition of what an opening show for a museum could look like. And this represents only 1%, 1 to 3% of that story. But also to literally restore these objects. And so at least 5 of the artists in this show, of them, for example, Huguette Caland and Etel Adnan, who I knew personally and had a degree of intimacy with and worked with on and with them throughout their life, passed away during the making of this show. And living with their objects and trying to acquire their objects that were, in essence, received as destroyed, and having to spend time, money, and resource to restore them to what they were, i.e. to make the hand of me or the institution invisible, was very challenging, especially after they had passed, because it was like a sense of accountability was present. And I guess what Michael is saying is, how do we create a world whereby we can exist but ensure that the accountability is held? I don't know if that's really possible, but I think that he is mad as a human. I mean, this is someone, I thought it was mad when I met him, that he is trying to recreate to scale 7,000 plus. It was 5,000 when I met him. But as the looted artifacts grow and the index of the numbers grows, the project grows and the assistants grow. And he's not someone of great wealth. You know, this is someone whose studio is in his house on the floor above where he lives. And these people are making these objects. Now, his life project is to reconstitute, but really, I think in this, what he called this as an intervention into our discussion, is that he's negotiating what he really wants to do, which is that the actual process of making this and the discussions that he has been creating, which is such as this proposition, are part of that act of trying to haunt, because these conversations become parts of archives that will live on. And that's what's important. These discussions have to be archived and remembered, because we need to not fall back onto history in the same way. But it leaves me feeling very uncomfortable, I have to say, because I don't know if the obsession with sending artifacts back can really, into a place, if we can really hold a sense of accountability for their care in those sites. And it's an ongoing debate, an argument that I have with Michael and with everyone who's in that debate, really.
But maybe we can shift the focus more to art institutions and institutional practice. And I would like to ask Shiraz and Bani, how do you see your work in the context of the public debates on decoloniality and decolonizing institutions, and the role that your art practice has and has had in a kind of decentering the canon? Because I think it does. If you'd like to respond to that.
Shiraz.
Me first. Well, it's a complicated one, right? And as you were saying, it is not just a singular dynamic. It goes both ways. What can be restituted? I mean,
but not focusing specifically on restitution, thinking more broadly in terms of what the decolonizing our thoughts and our institutions.
It's a process that has to take place through every institution, I think. And I think, museums have to take assessment of themselves every so often as to what their future is going to be. At each junction, what is it? What is your purpose? Because for sure, through the 19th century, those creations of those collections was very much through the process of looting. And what is it that takes place today? I mean, if I can use an example of Kew Gardens, a different type of collection. This is a project I'm doing right now. It's where I was introduced to the idea of the live collection, right? This collection of botanical plants, most of which are collected during during the mid-19th century, and earlier, and many of those plants still living today. And actually, Kew has created a really incredible statement about what its future should be about. And it's about trying to repair the damages that have taken place. It talks about itself as being a major engine of the British Empire, that it was tasked with not really the expansion of language through science, but actually it was about finding resource for industry. And that today, and so that, the very hand of recording and placing within the museum collection was also the very hand that was erasing the ability for those things for these plants to exist in their natural context.
What will you be doing at Kew Gardens?
Well, we're working on a new film work there, but Kew talks about that actually it's in a unique position because it has these incredible seed banks that it can now start to look at trying to return certain types of plants and trees back to their environments. This is a form. It's certainly an incredible symbolic gesture, and it shuffles the deck in the UK in terms of what other institutions now need to look at themselves in that sense. And I don't think it's just necessarily arts institutions that need to go through this process. I think, like I said, it's all forms of public and governmental institutions that need that.
But can I say something? That's what frustrates me, is this idea of symbolism, metaphor in place of action. If you drive from Cairo to Alexandria, you cannot go off-road because there are landmines there that have been left by the British for however long, and it would cost billions upon billions to remove them. So kids run in them and they can still be active and they lose limbs. How do you create seats of accountability for those kinds of things? And that's what I mean about, I sometimes worry that we get instrumentalized as practitioners in these broader debates, which are, can you please take accountability for the stains that you have left? And for me, what art does is it's not that it holds a mirror, is it creates a space for me to not be angry all the time. Because if I did just live through that, I would just be angry at everybody.
Yeah. I mean, in the case of Mauritius, sorry, just one last thing, is that, absolutely, what is the possibilities of even this action of returning plants and trees? Because actually the recreation of those ecosystems is almost impossible to recreate. I mean, for example, in Mauritius, with 300 years of monocropping of sugar, there is very little biomass left in the soil. So actually, when people recreate gardens, or when people are trying to grow new forests or start new farms, they have to put the insects into the soil now, because there is such little left. So absolutely, what are the potentials? But for sure, it's a major movement forward when the government in the UK at this moment in time, and it's very controversial, but are limiting these organisations. So, for example, a lot of them are being told they can't use the term decolonial anymore in any communications. So there is also this pushback against them.
Sure. Bani, I really loved in our previous interview when you talked about your experiences of growing up in Karachi versus the kind of information you had access, and you talked about you only had access to black and white books of the Western art historical canon. So
I was going to talk exactly about this because I was just finishing organizing that work, but so I of course question the basis of a museum, the importance and how central it is to ideas of a civilization. And it's very much like a church for me, to be honest. And because I didn't grow up with any museums around me. And when it came to what I find only have now kind of started enjoying when I'm living in Germany, and there's much more of an awareness of chronology and the trajectory of art history or art practice, especially in the German Academy, where you enroll to be a student of so-and-so, and they were a student of so-and-so, and people often create that lineage, and they want that, and I often ask myself, what is my lineage? And it's really fuzzy. And when I start thinking about the fuzziness of it, I think about the fact that a lot of my exposure to Western art history was actually all through Xeroxed copies, and that had been copied multiple times over. So nothing was entirely clear. It was all black and white and gray. So the original, the experience of going and sitting in front of something and drawing from it was just not part of my... So I had a very light and half-formed knowledge of art history. And do I feel slightly awkward about it or not? I feel it was liberating, that it was never impressed upon me. It was not impressive enough in its physical presence. So I think I'm very interested in the idea of the weakened, distorted, and passing of information, and how we all in a lot of the colonized world had these kind of single books that were multiplied many times, and that's how was our interaction. So I question how important, and especially after this documenta, when you see the entire museum collapse, on art spaces collapse, it's very liberating actually to think about, just question the whole thing, and it is a provocation because it's not easy to think that way, but I think it's a fun thought.
Omar, thinking about institutions and collections, before we open to the public, would you like to share with us what it means for you to be building this collection in Sharjah, from Sharjah, within this decolonial agenda in mind, but also thinking of all the movements and transits of the locality?
Yeah, I think it's important to know how the collection began, which is that it grew out of the Sharjah Biennial, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary next month, opening February 7th. And in a sense, the seed for the context of how the biennial operates today came out of an experience that happened in Germany, which was that our president and director, Hurul Qasimi, had been encouraged to go to Okuenwe's documenta, and she really was had she have been an artist actually in Sharjah Biennial, where it was operating on a city and state model, and did not understand why it couldn't be curated in this fashion. And now this was also the 20th anniversary of her tenure. And so this idea of this all happening in and around, constellating around Germany is kind of an important point, because whatever you may think of this site, it has offered a platform for many debates and contexts. But the works were acquired from there, which means that they are often works that were made for a place, never to be moved, never to be acquired. Like that boat, Cyprus by Rayan Tabet. It's a performance. It's not a sculpture in my mind. It is not a piece that can sustain hanging like that for a very long time. This is not an exhibition that can exist in this way. And many of the works, you know, when they are photographed or when they are lent and reproduced in different sites, the photograph that is often used is of its in the original site. So there's this very weighted context. And Bani, when you're reflecting about your show in Beit el-Serkal, Bani had a survey exhibition in one of our heritage buildings, which was a hospital and the former ambassador's home. And the context is like a palimpsest. There are all these layers and skin in a place that supposedly is only 2 years old according to the world, right? But that's not the case. So being aware of that history is why I'm interested, because I feel that what exists in a certain public imagination is very different. And what I try and do is work with essentially a leadership that is really open to testing out new ideas, but also to having what I try and call an East-East, South-South conversation, which is that it's not that I don't like Andy Warhol. I love Andy Warhol. I have his work on view in a group show now. But if I have this amount of money, it's not going to go to buying an Andy Warhol. It's going to be about how do I create an ecosystem or support an ecosystem that runs from Southwest Asia to East Africa, that is meaningful, that is in depth, and that you can constellate and cluster. But it is really challenging, because you mentioned the archive before. There difficulty of even getting provenance for certain historical works, which is like including some of the works here just to bring them here. A year of chasing provenance for one single work in this exhibition to be able to show it. These things we don't talk about. Those things, that's what I call expensive. Time. Time is the most expensive of things. And our labor, that's what I want us to understand, is that there is a labor and a love in this. And I hope that people, you know, I never wanted the Sharjah Art Foundation collection to be in the subtitle, and I should actually pay credit in this moment that it was actually Sofia that came up with the subtitle, because we were discussing with Dirk that we needed to contextualize, and I said to Sofia, here are my rambling notes, can you help me cluster them into something? And Sofia aided me in putting diasporic imagination in this, and I'm actually very proud now that it's there, because I hope whatever happens after this show, that the people who can help build infrastructure will be inspired to continue to do so and to continue to invest in that, even though we live in difficult times where resources are scarce.
Thank you. I think it's a good time to open to your questions. It would be wonderful to see how you responded to the exhibition, what questions it might have raised, or doubts or ideas. Thank you.
I have one question regarding Michael Rakowitz, and I'm curious what happened after he wrote this letter. Do any of you know what the response of the institution was of this bold proposal to exchange or give his work and for the return of one of these original reliefs?
I can comment on that. And this is not the first time that Michael has made this offer. He did make this offer once before, and it was furiously turned down in a very kind of violent exchange. That institution is confidential. The response is very positive. And that's why he's chosen not to mention the institution, because he doesn't want to jeopardize it happening. But the response from the staff and the leadership in the museum is very positive. But then there are laws and situations such as an accredited museum cannot deaccession a work without XYZ reason, right? And there has to be a national policy, as for example we see in France at the moment, which isn't necessarily always fulfilling its mission, but it's positive. So I think that even that, for me, is hopeful, a result.
Thank you. Any other question from the floor?
We also like people who sing to us, people who have a dance interpretation of the exhibition, people who have a drawing sketch that inspired them, your own stories that you want to share. You can also comment on fashion, today's fashion. How has 2023 been? Happy New Year. I think it's been pretty sucky, to be honest. But it's not been as hopeful as I anticipated. But
we've just had the flu.
Me too, actually, last week. But
months of flu.
In the UK they're talking about the flu-COVID delicious combo, and no one's seeing each other. But the pandemic did delay this exhibition actually by almost 2 years.
So is this going to actually, what are the plans for actual building or space in Sharjah?
So one of the things that happened that was really positive from looking at the work was that there were certain works that couldn't be shown because there were no provenance trails that were acquired like 20 years ago. And we started to train people to start to explore those. So we started to reveal more and more of the collection. And that has revealed the necessity for a different kind of space. So what has happened now is we've been offered a different piece of land that would allow us to build a consolidated space for storage and the collection that's larger, but also situated near the education city. This is all very confidential, although we're now live streaming. But this is always provisional. Everything is always provisional in any city planning situation. But the hope is that we create, we're very happy that there is institution building in the region, that in Saudi Arabia there are cultural institutions developing, and that the Guggenheim Abu Dhabi might get built. But what we also aspire to collectively as an institutional team, amongst my colleagues at least, is that we can have trained professionals who want to stay and care for these things. That's the hardest part of this, is understanding care is a mutual game, as it were, that is really exhausting, and it's a skill set that is not necessarily understood, for example, in the part of the world where I work, that a conservator or registrar is as important as an architect or an engineer and should be treated accordingly. And that's the biggest deficit we have. And that's what delays everything. Because if everything is not ready, if things are not ready to be displayed, then why build it, right? And so, in a way, it speaks to the, sorry to linger, but actually it links back to the very existence of why the Sharjah Biennial became a foundation, which is essentially, it's a heritage project. The biennial came out of, into this model where dilapidated architectures, ruins, such as, Otobong Nakanga's piece, which is now a permanent installation, aging ruins, is a way to encourage not bureaucrats, but politicians to see these spaces, these histories differently, and to understand that they shouldn't be raised, but you should invest in caring for them. And so what really has emerged is the care for heritage and buildings and sites. Now we need to transpose that knowledge into the actual objects that are in those buildings as well. And that's the challenging part, is to continue to develop that knowledge base.
Do you want to? Sorry. No.
Yeah, no, I just remember from my show in Beth el Sarkal that it's also very touching what the relationship between people who live in the neighborhoods and the museum is, and it isn't always museum-going audiences at all. So you have badminton and football in the space outside, kids playing the whole evening, families, food being sold. But it's also because the museums and the spaces are free at SHARJAH Foundation. There are lots of young couples and young people just wandering in. No one's really looking at anything. They're just using the free Wi-Fi and the air conditioning because it's so hot. And that's really, and I spoke to Hoor about it, and she says, yeah, that's great, because it's sort of on the periphery, but these are actually wonderful spaces that we're creating for people to enter in hot afternoons. And the art is just just happens also.
But that's
and I think that's
brilliant.
quite beautiful.
It's so beautiful, because I think culture now, generally, with the thickening of the digital sphere and everything else, it's all taken in through osmosis as well. So to create the context for that, but also the context for convenience, I think that's what SHARJAH has been for so many of us. Like, when I went there for the first time 12 years ago to speak on a panel discussion, the way it happened, it was so easy. It was just, someone said, you really need to go there to meet your people. And I was like, okay, and I saw that there was this March meeting, this conference. I literally just wrote an email. And I said, okay, you can come and speak about your work. That generosity of spirit, that openness to allowing someone whose experience and knowledge base is unknown, created. It was a meeting back then. You spoke for 5 minutes, really. It wasn't like you spoke for 5 minutes, but you got to meet people, from every socio-cultural, gender, sexuality status, that it totally contradicts any sense of what the imagination is. That I just fell in love with this place, and I've seen it change so much. But that's like I feel like people who live there have like a sense of loyalty and safety to the place, despite some of the difficulties that it might present. But I think like that idea of like using the Wi-Fi, like my issue is that, say when we write text on the wall, right? And they say, you need to give more words. And I say, but I don't care about, the museum director from the US when I write this text. I'm thinking about those free Bangladeshi kids who are like kicking each other with their football, and they're hot, and they
go in,
and they fall upon Gallery 6, and they're like going to cool down. They might see one sentence like with slightly bigger text that might look like, a T-shirt slogan that might keep them in the space. And that context informs so much of what we do. But it's actually, that's how we win in a way, is like when we speak to ourselves as opposed to an imagined international community that really doesn't exist in the same way that it did 10 years ago.
Yeah. Any other questions from the audience? We would love to hear your thoughts.
If you're also exhausted, you can say, we're tired, you speak in so many times, your accents.
There's a question here. There's a question.
Going back to fuzziness, and maybe from football to art, you spoke about tradition of arts in the West, and that it, in very small portions were handled and seen in your context. I would like to know a little bit more about your thinking of form and tradition of art, references, artistic references in your work, because we are so much into this discussion of politics, social things, decolonizing, and these really big and very important questions and issues, no question. But just tell us a little bit about how did you decide, you did an installation work here, how did you decide the form of it, and, you know, getting back to the early point of my education of art, where, you know, it was always a question of form and content, and so we spoke about the content, we might switch to the form for a few minutes.
I think this, where I do, most of my work is fictional, and it's slightly sort of dry, it's humorous. So the installation here doesn't typify my work. But I would say, generally in my practice, it is exactly that. It is drawn from stand-up, not stand-up, but comedy shows in, because we've had so many dictatorships, very serious dictatorships. There was a lot of censorship, and there were a lot of experiences of when comedy had sort of these hidden messages. So that it's drawn from that, and then traditions of poetry and oral storytelling and lamentation and music, which come from religious experiences, to living in the US. And it is really, it's incredibly hybrid, and that is kind of what I celebrate as my influence, to getting very, a huge exposure to international cinema. So my work mostly that I do with video is less inspired or coming from the history of video art projects and more from cinema. So I would say that it is incredibly, it's very open. And I think the only consistent thing that I'm interested in is the idea of humor being a way to relate to, as a disarming way to make people comfortable and to associate with my characters and deal with, and actually one of my favorite and my guru in the way I started making film is a Palestinian filmmaker, Elia Suleiman, who is New York based, and I think he kind of changed the way, because he spoke about the occupied territories in a way that is incredibly brilliant, in a very humorous way. And I think that was like 22 years ago, and he changed the way he made me, convinced me that was the only way to work, to bring in humor.
Maybe this question. First of all, I didn't know that Elias Suleiman was such an influence, and now I see it from reserved but onwards. But maybe also the question applies to Shiraz as well, in terms of thinking about the form of how you compose these very different manifestations.
Yeah, I mean, a
of
lot
the performative as well.
The performative, yeah. I mean, I work across quite a lot of mediums. I mean, the work that I'm about to show in Sharjah this year is very sculptural based, and actually a lot of the work thinks a lot about the language of museology, the way that things are presented or extracted. And so a lot of my sculptures are sometimes, you know, things, they are vitrines or they are plinths themselves, and, you know, recreations, sometimes objects that I've collected, but often objects that I've recreated. I mean, in terms of influences, I think similarly to Bani, you know, it's not necessarily what you might imagine being high art influences. They're often actually, you know, trash films, you know, Hollywood mass consumption, because these are the things that we are, you know, are surrounded by. But also, you know, doubly, because also often thinking about how, you know, in Asia, you know, back on the continent, you know, often, you know, art didn't exist in the museum, right? The museum is a construct post-Salon, post-19th century, and so when you're being, you know, when you're in the global South, art is in the temple, it's in the mosque, it's in the street, it's part of all the fabrics. The society is layered with that. And so, you know, who are those artisans? You know, does it matter that their names have been erased? Maybe, you know, the idea of the artist being so central and the artist's name being so central is also a contemporary thing, right? And so you know, it's often kind of interrogating that, but also taking influence from multiple spaces and the architecture of those spaces. you know, is a lot of what forms it. You know, I did a series of little ceramic pieces that takes the language of sort of the Louis XVI ceramic tableware and that really over elaborate sort of follies that come out, and that stuff that was being created was so elaborate because of the extreme wealth that was being made through sugar at the time. You know, so I kind of reference these types of forms as well, but not necessarily out of love of them either. Sometimes it's out of the horror of what they are. But how that language ultimately has permeated into the way that we
and I also wonder, I wonder what you think about that. But I don't think form is so at the forefront. So there is not. I never felt at any moment that what I'm doing needs to be really cutting edge or avant-garde, that I need to enter any history, that I need to make a mark and change the way anything is looked at. So those motivations have never been part. So I think that kind of, which I think was there when I was studying in the US amongst my contemporaries. I think the biggest motivation was, what can you do that has never been done before? And I think that is the most uninteresting, because what has never been done before is so complex. And for me, it's the content of the work. So what form it takes, of course, it's brilliant if I do sometimes have a good idea of form and content, but it's not driving me in that manner.
I think material is often part of the big driver that leads me to why something is then made in a certain way, because the symbolism of that material and the memories of those aesthetics and when you've maybe first encountered them and all those kinds of things from childhood to now, you know, I think that also drives part of
your memories.
Yeah.
Would you like to respond as well to this idea of form in the context and materiality in the context of the show?
I would just like to say that I do think that form is part of this show because it begins the shows. There are 3 generations in the show. It wasn't initially intended to be as such, but that's kind of how it manifests. And form is certainly in certain contexts used as a kind of, or rather from the work of Adam Hnain to Hassan Sharif to Munir Farmafani and Uget Kaland as a kind of the deconstruction of a certain archetypal notion of form is used as a way to make a rupture of thinking. But so what I believe is the form is used as an instrument to bring us back to content, right? So maybe that's why it's for me different than a lot of what my also art historical schooling might have presented to me. But what I'd like to say is that because I know we're going to have to close in a few minutes, is that as this exhibition goes on and as this, I have a moment to reflect, which I still don't feel like I've had, is that some of the language that we're using, we need to sit down and interrogate, I think, in closed rooms, because even sitting here, I find it very difficult to look at the audience, because why? Because I want to pretend that they don't exist, and so that I can be truly honest, right? It's very hard to do that, and we don't create enough of those salon-like spaces. I'm not talking about the salon exhibition, of course. So, for example, for me, I don't use decolonial, I use contra-colonial as a term because I see it as more active and powerful, a way to think. I try not to use the term Global South because I find that it is not from our tongue, and I find it too politicized, and I don't want to flatten difference. But actually, there was something that a final word, which was Ghislaine Tawadros, who is the new director of Whitechapel Gallery, where Sofia and I worked together as colleagues for years, and did envisaged and dreamed of many projects, some of which materialized, some of which didn't, right? The best projects were on the tube home. That's when the dreaming happened, right? That was the best stuff. But Ghislaine begins her book of collected essays, which was just released, by talking about, she was also the founding director of INNOVA, the International Institute for Visual Art, which was the first organization in Great Britain to, funded by the Arts Council to celebrate the work of black and minority Asian ethnic artists, a term that we contest now in Britain, an acronym. And she says, my life's work in essence, and this book is about how do we celebrate difference on its own terms, and how do we allow difference to exist differently, essentially. And I don't really know what that means, but essentially, I think that differences need to sully each other, and we need to be able to not fetishize them, but allow them to exist. And they should exist in a way that is contextual and meaningful to them, but nothing should exist simply because of its difference, in my opinion, which is why the conversation about form and being the next best great, whatever, becomes I think too difficult and too actually not particularly useful in this cultural moment.
Okay. Are there any further comments or questions?
I think
there's one here.
This, I think, should be our last because of time.
Yes. Yes, last question.
I want to ask the curator or the artists to kind of, in the context of a German society like the one we're living in right now, what do you hope this exhibition could bring to bring more common sense to the conversation, for example, of colonialism, decolonialism, or also the culture of remembering, like the Holocaust?
I mean, from my perspective, you know, it's really about sharing and creating a space for encounter of how different histories actually relate to each other, and how, but also how they can be completely independent. And it is about, for me, it's about the hope that all of these works can be seen on their own terms, but also I have to say that when there are certain institutions that I walk into that are incredibly prestigious, including in this very city, you walk into their modern and contemporary buildings and I just find it embarrassing because it's just like 1960s and 70s minimalist, formalist aesthetic, but okay, it's wonderful, but it doesn't seem to evolve the obsession with form over any notion of content. And I just hope that these kinds of exhibitions can shift us from purely formal obsession into one that allows for a bit more, a kind of freedom of expression from many different perspectives. I'm not sure how artists feel about it, though, or ones that live here, because the artists only saw the exhibition today for the first time.
I haven't seen it yet.
You haven't seen it?
No,
Oh my God. Bani hasn't even seen it.
Well, the geographical spread and also the timeline that it covers, and the opportunity to see a lot of overlooked female artists, for example, which are rarely seen or maybe now only begin to be seen. I think it's something very special, discovering artists that from Cairo that I had never heard of. So for me, the experience is also about confronting ourselves with other traditions, or with traditions that haven't been shown in the museums in this part of the world. And I think that is very hopeful and enriching in terms of...
And I think what's interesting is that it is a collection coming from the Emirates. So it's kind of somebody who has bought over time, or a group that's collected stuff with a certain set of concerns. So it's been packaged and presented rather than somebody here curating and bringing together. So it's kind of one level of organization and narrative building that has been packaged and presented. So that makes it a different show than a show which would have included all these geographies and artists. So I think that is very particular about this show.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I think it's the moment to bring this session to a closure, but I would like once again to thank Director Dirk Lukov, but also Annette Sievert and Laura Kohler. Thank you so much to the team here at Deichtorhallen. And I would like to thank this wonderful group of people, Omar Kholeif, Bani Abidi, Shiraz Bayjoo. It was a huge pleasure and privilege to be here with you. And thanks to you all. We, of course, invite you to visit the show. I think it's still open for 1 more hour, correct? So please do it if you haven't visited. And there's a great catalog that you can have access to in the bookshop, which gathers some of these ideas and short texts on each of the artists present in the show. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Sofia. Did you find it?